Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're going to be refactoring our app from our last video, Easy SwiftUI MVVM API Call using URLSession. Now in this video, we're going to be using Combine this time to see how we can actually use Apple's reactive programming framework to make API requests. Now we're going to be building on top of the previous video to do that. If you need the start project, you can actually get this from my GitHub. So let's get straight into it. So just to quickly go over this before we actually, dive straight in. All we've got here is we just got our view, which is listening to our view model, which has a source of truth for whether it's refreshing, and our users that you see on the screen here. Also as well, within our view model, we have the business logic needed to actually fetch users from this API endpoint. And then our view model is using this model to actually convert our data from our response, to convert our data from the response for our app to use and present on the UI. So that's pretty much it. Now, what I want to do is in our view model, I want to actually create another function that actually does the exact same thing, but this time it uses combine. So let's do that now. So in our file, I'm just going to collapse this to make a bit more space. And then we're going to create a new function called fetch users new. Now, I know this isn't the best name, but it's just for the purposes of showing you that you can have an alternative version of this in Combine. Cool. So when you're working with Combine, there's two concepts that you need to be aware of. The first is it uses functional programming, such as high order functions, and it also uses publishers so you can actually listen to and subscribe to changes. And I actually break down these concepts in my video, getting started with Combine, with practical examples. So you should check that out as well, which is a free online course for how to use Combine. Now, the first thing we're going to do is actually type out the first bit of our Combine function for starting a network request. So let's do that now. Cool. So within this iflet, we're actually using the URL session, but this time, rather than us having a closure, we instead have this function here called data task publisher. So what does this do? Well, this actually means that it actually returns a publisher, meaning that we can only interact with the request object once it finishes executing, but we can actually observe and listen to the changes that happen when you make an API request. So what I like to do is actually make sure that I add in after this that we receive the response on the main thread, and we can do this by just using the receive on function after our function, like so. So after here, if we just do dot receive, what we're saying is we want to set up our publisher for executing our request with this URL, and then we want to receive the response that we get back from this on the main thread. One thing I actually mentioned before is how we use high order functions with Combine, so functional programming. So what's actually happening is that when we use this receives on, it's actually modifying the publisher from our previous function, and this time tanking on top that we should receive the response on the main thread. So after you receive the response on the main thread, the next thing you want to do is actually handle converting the data to your model. Now we can do this in Combine by using a function called map and accessing the data from our response. So let's do that now. So after our receive on, we're going to type out map, and we're going to actually use the key path to access the data. So let's do that. So now what it's going to do is it's actually going to access the data property from our response that we get back from our URLSession data task publisher. Now we need to actually handle decoding our object back from the service as well, and we're able to do this by using the decode function. So after our map, we want to call decode, and then within the type, we want the type that it decodes it to be is the user. And then within this decoder, we can actually pass in a JSON decoder. Now for this example, I'm just going to pass in a default one like so. So we set up our flow here where we create our URL request. We tell it when we want to receive a response back on the main thread. We also capture our data and we try to decode it. The next thing we need to do is actually listen to when everything has finished and handle our response. So the last step here is actually going to get our decoded object, and we want to set this to the user's source of truth within this file. So in order to do that, there's a function in Combine called sync. And what sync allows you to do is it allows you to listen to when the publisher has finished or if it's been cancelled, as well as when you receive a new value. So for now, we're just going to handle receiving a new value, and we'll come back to the other receive completion later. What we're saying here is we actually want to get the final value that we got for after all of this has happened, and then we're going to get our users. We're using weak self, so we don't have a retain cycle, and we're going to set the users within our source of truth here, users. Now let's actually test this out and see what happens. So rather than us actually using our fetch users in our content view, this time we're going to use our fetch users new. Cool. So let's actually run this, and then we'll see what happens. So our fetch users new, like so. So let's actually run this and see what happens. And you'll notice that when you run this, nothing is actually happening. Well, why is that? Well, we've actually got a problem, and if you actually notice, if you go back to our view model, we actually have a warning here saying that the result of call to sync is unused. So remember how I said before with functional programming, it's actually modifying itself, returning a new version of itself based on the functions applied onto it. Well, what's actually happening here is that it's actually returning the publisher, but because we don't actually store the publisher anywhere, it actually disposes of it when we actually call the function. So it's actually not kept alive in memory. So how can we fix this? Well, in order to actually fix this and to store our publisher for as long as our view model is alive, we need to store it within a cancelable. So we can actually create a collection of any cancellables, and this is what we will use to almost create a bag of a collection of these publishers so that we can listen to changes and react to them within our view. In order to do that, the first we need to do is import Combine. And then within our class, we're just going to create a private set of any cancellables. So you may be wondering, why is this a set and not an array? Well, the reason why is because with a set, all the objects within them are unique. So by using this, we'll actually ensure that we don't get duplicates of the same publisher. We'll only have one instance of it. Now we can actually store the value of our publisher that gets returned from our sync within this bag by using the store in function. So let's add that in after now. Now what's going to happen is going to store the publisher within this bag so that whenever we call this function, this is actually kept alive and isn't disposed of. So if we actually go back into our view, and this time if we hit run, you'll notice that we now have a list of our users. So it's really important that when you're working with Combine that you store your publisher within some kind of cancelable. And if we actually compare this to what we had before, you can see that our fetch users is way bigger than our Combine. So this is actually a lot more concise, and it is easier to read in my opinion, because you just basically follow it line by line in terms of what's going on. And you can also make sure that you capture any cases of where things go wrong a lot easier as well. But in our example before, we actually added in error handling and also the ability to handle a loading spinner. So first of all, let's do the loading spinner, because we just need to set is refreshing to true and false within our sync closure. So let's do that now. So within our fetch users new, what we're going to do is if it successfully decodes the URL, we're going to set is refreshing to true. And then within our sync's completion, so when it's completed the action, we're actually going to set is refreshing back to false. So now this will help us ensure that when we call our function that you actually see the progress view, and then when it finishes, it will actually remove it as well because there is refreshing. And it's worth noting that we only want to include the is refreshing within the if let, because if this fails to decode the URL, then we don't want to set this to true because it's not going to start the process to fetch an API request. Now that we've handled the loading state, what we want to do now is actually handle any errors as well, and we can do this within our sync. So let's add this in now and then I'll break it down. So within our sync's completion, what we have here is, I'll get back to this in a second, but we're actually listening to the result of our publisher. So if it's failed, then we're actually going to get the error, and then we're going to set has error is equal to true. And then we're actually going to set the error property that we define within this view model to be a custom error that we found. Now, what we're actually doing is we're also setting has error to false whenever we start to fetch new users. And if you never saw what this defer is, essentially what this just means is that this is the last thing that's going to execute within the scope of this closure. So this does make sure that we never forget to set is refreshing back to false. So let's actually see if this works for us now. So if I just go back, so if I actually just run this on the simulator where I just mess up the URL, you should now see that we also get our error on the screen because we're actually passing in an invalid URL. But if you actually look at our example from above, we actually do have our own custom error here called failed to decode. So how can we actually send our own custom errors and capture this within our sync? Rather than actually letting the system decode this for us, instead we're going to handle this ourselves so that we can capture any errors and throw them as well. Now, in our Combine, we actually do use this function called decode, which actually manually allows us to automatically decode it for us. But what I want to do is that rather than using this, I actually want to throw my user error failed to decode within this chain of actions. So let's remove this. And then rather than using decode, instead we're going to use a function called try map. So within this try map function, what we want to do is we want to try to map our data to our users model, so our collection of users, and if it fails, we'll throw an error, or else we'll return our users. So the reason why we can throw an error in here is because of the try with the try map. It allows us to throw errors. If we throw an error, it'll actually trigger this failure within our sync. So let's do that now. So what we do is we create our own JSON decoder. We actually decode the data back from our service to this collection of users. If it fails, within our guard statement, we'll throw a fail to decode, or else we'll just simply return the users. Let's actually see if with our invalid URL, we actually see our custom error fail to decode. So I'm expecting to see the message failed to decode response. So let's run this again now. Cool. So as you can see, we now get our custom error. So if you ever want to have a situation where you manually handle throwing your own custom errors, then you probably want to use this function here called try map, where you can add in your own logic, and depending on that, you can actually, change and do what needs to be done. So one error that we did here was that we did it where it failed to decode. But what about if I actually want to add in another thrown case for whether the response is not within a valid range? So when you actually call an API, there's a valid range for whenever a API response was successful or not. So the range that I actually want to check for in here is between 200 and 300 as well. So rather than us actually mapping our data here, what we want to do is we actually want to check the response and see if it's within that range. So first of all, let's add a new case in here called invalid status code. And then within our error description, we're going to add a new message in. And then what we want to do is we actually want to use this invalid status code error within this try map. Now, if you actually try and use this data, you'll notice that it's just a data object, so we can't actually access the response to check the status code. So what we actually want to do in order to check the status code is we want to remove our map, because this map is accessing the data from our response, and we just want to access the entire object that we get back from our publisher. So let's remove this. And then now let's change this from data to res. And now you should notice that when you type out res, you can see that the type is different. It's not a data no more. It's URLSession data task publisher, which is this here. So it returns what this is returning here. So on our res, you'll notice that we can access our data and our response. So before we do our response, the first thing we're going to need to do is actually update this here. So let's change this from data to res.data. So we access the data from our response. And then before we try to decode our data, the next thing we want to do is we actually want to check to see if we're within a valid range. So let's do that now. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're basically checking to see if our response is within 200 and 300, then it will continue. If it isn't, then we're actually going to throw an error here saying invalid status code. So with our messed up URL that we have here, realistically, this alert should actually say falls within an invalid range. So let's actually see if this works now. Cool. And you can see here that our request falls within an invalid range because this isn't a valid URL. So we're probably getting a 404 error here. So let's actually just remove this and let's just run it again and see what happens. Cool. And now you can see that we see a list of all our users because we're in a valid range. So this all works. So as you can see, Combine is actually really useful and easy to use when you want to handle networking, and it allows you to see your request in a more human readable way because you can actually follow it like a chain in terms of what's happening on the screen. So yeah, Combine's pretty nice. Well, that's everything in this video. If you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you left some feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you on a bit. Deuces.